While Trump was threatening allies at the G7, Canada made a move so bold even the EU wasn't ready. There was no announcement, no media blitz, just a 30-second statement in French. That signaled the end of US military dominance. Canada is walking away from $73 billion in American defense deals and stepping into Europe's $150 billion SAFE program. Lockheed Martin cut out. NATO rattled and the US not even in the room. This isn't diplomacy, it's realignment. And if Canada can pull this off, the global defense map is about to change permanently at the G7 summit in Alberta while headlines track Trump's escalating tariff threats. Canada issued a quiet but foundational reversal of post-World War II alignment in a 30-second owned French-language passage, which was largely ignored by US media. Prime Minister Mark Carney declared that predominance is a thing of the past, referring to America's global leadership. This wasn't political theatre, it was a recalibration since April 2, 2025, when Trump's tariff campaign began. The US has levied broad-based duties on aluminum, steel, electronics and agricultural imports, even targeting its own allies. Bloomberg data shows that retaliatory tariffs from Canada, the EU and Japan have already slashed US export growth by 17% year-over-year. Against that backdrop, Carney's declaration wasn't symbolic. It signaled a formal geopolitical shift. A close US ally openly decoupling from Washington's defense and economic orbit, and what followed wasn't a walk back, it was acceleration. Carney's use of French wasn't a stylistic flourish, it was a strategic filtration by speaking in a language unfamiliar to most American audiences but native to many EU officials. He bypassed domestic political escalation and addressed Brussels directly in those 30 seconds. He outlined a realignment towards stable democracies who share our interests, a direct appeal to European leaders, not Washington. Within 48 hours, European Council President Antonio Costa and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed Canada would likely sign a formal defence procurement agreement at the June 23 Canada-EU summit. Reuters reports that the deal would give Canada access to SAFE, the EU's €150 billion joint defence programme, under a clause that requires 65% of all arms to be EU-made or sourced from officially partnered states. Carney wasn't criticising Trump, he was cutting past him, and the EU wasn't just listening, it was preparing to respond for decades. Canada's defence spending flowed disproportionately to US contractors with 75 cents of every defence capital dollar, roughly 73 billion Canadian dollars over 45 years allocated to American firms primarily through Lockheed Martin's F-35 program. But in March 2025, Carney directed the Ministry of Defence to seek alternatives, and by April, Defence Minister Bill Blair confirmed to CBC that Sweden's submarine was under consideration. The Financial Times notes that Portugal, too, is pulling back from F-35 orders, citing cost overruns and political risk, compounding the issue US tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Critical inputs for warship and jet production have increased raw material costs by 22%, according to the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. What was once framed as interdependence is now seen as financial vulnerability. Carney isn't just shopping around, he's rewriting the terms of Canada's military supply chain, and that exit is already funded. Canada's military has long been underfunded. Spending dipped below 1% of GDP in the early 2010s, but no US administration until Trump's turned defense cooperation into a transactional risk. The former ask for more spending turned into a threat of abandonment, prompting a defensive realignment rather than increased. Alignment. Carney's response: Canada will now meet NATO's 2% target 5 years early, according to his May speech. But he framed the decision not as compliance, but as insulation. Our military infrastructure and equipment have aged, he stated. citing that only one of 4 submarines is operational and fewer than half of land and sea vehicles are combat-ready, rather than depend on discounted gear from a politically volatile supplier. Carney is pursuing full-spectrum independence. The shift in timing isn't about NATO metrics, it's about preempting vulnerability to US unpredictability. The EU's reaction wasn't polite applause. It was strategic recalibration. Van der Leyen confirmed that Canada's upcoming Pact would grant access to the SAFE program under the bloc's Readiness 2030 initiative, aimed at consolidating supply chains and avoiding US entanglement under safe nations, can exceed EU debt limits to fund defence bypassing traditional fiscal restraints. Australia signed a parallel agreement the same week with Prime Minister Albanese stating it would open the door to joint procurement. These aren't symbolic alignments, they're institutional ones. The Wall Street Journal noted that European defence spending grew 8.3% in 2024, the largest one-year jump since 1989, and SAFE is designed to scale it further, especially if Canada joins what caught Brussels off guard. Wasn't Carney's rhetoric, it was his precision. He didn't threaten to leave America behind. He drafted new blueprints without waiting for permission. For decades, the US defense industry has treated allied procurement as reliable. Revenue Canada alone was expected to transfer over $73 billion to American firms under its F-35 contract according to Public Services and Procurement Canada, but that stream is drying up in March 2025. Carney's office formally directed defense planners to reassess the F-35 deal the following month. Portugal began cancelling its orders, and Canada placed Saab's Gripen E under active consideration. Bloomberg estimates that Lockheed Martin could face a $9.1 billion exposure if partner nations follow suit. But this isn't just about aircraft. Canada's broader shift includes centralizing procurement sourcing materials like aluminum and cyber teak domestically, and redirecting contracts toward firms outside the US ecosystem. That means fewer guaranteed deals for Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. And if a G7 country can decouple from America's defense pipeline, it calls into question how many others might already be preparing to. Let's be blunt. If the country most deeply embedded in America's defense posture is now opting for European integration, who's quietly mapping the same exit Australia's deal with the EU confirmed at the June G7 by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese opens immediate access to SAFE's €150 billion co-procurement fund. Meanwhile, France is leading radar acquisitions with Bulgaria under the same framework. The Wall Street Journal reported in May that EU defence output rose 7% over 18 months, twice the growth rate of US defence manufacturing safes clause, mandating 65%. EU content is no small footnote. It's a structural incentive to source locally and cut US suppliers out. And with Trump signaling that NATO defense may no longer be guaranteed, the calculus for nations like Spain, Italy, or even Japan isn't ideological, it's actuarial. So tell me this. If you were running procurement for a European ally today, would you gamble on America's mood swings or start placing safer bets? Canada's sovereignty shift isn't just ideological, it's arithmetic. Carney told CBC that 75 cents of every Canadian defence capital dollar goes to the US. That's not a complaint, it's a cost centre, with US tariffs driving up the price of steel and raw materials by over 22% and potential surcharges on finished parts. Canadian officials have recalculated domestic reindustrialisation as not just feasible, but honestly essential, according to figures from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Redirecting even 35% of future procurement domestically could generate 34,000 high-wage jobs and over $8.3 billion Canadian dollars in annual GDP output. More importantly, the newly centralised Defence Procurement Agency gives Ottawa leverage to standardise contracts, localise cybersecurity hardware, and re-anchor rare earth mineral supply chains in provinces like Quebec and Alberta. Canada's shift isn't just escaping US dependency, it's building an entire ecosystem where defense policy and economic resilience are, mutually reinforcing. Defense realignment rarely happens with a headline, it happens with a contract. Quietly not renewed, the EU SAFE Fund passed in May 2025 lets member states bypass deficit rules to co-finance joint arms production, and Canada's expected signing of the Security and Defence Pact on June 23rd would legally qualify it for participation. The Wall Street Journal confirms that once ratified, Canada could submit co-production proposals as early as the third quarter of 2025. That puts Ottawa inside the EU's industrial deficit network before Washington even responds, and with SAFE aiming to fund projects before year end. The clock is honestly ticking as defense firms, once globally dominant, are now watching allies opt into deals they're not invited to. Meanwhile, Trump's Golden Dome pitch to Canada, a $61 billion missile defense package, or $0 if they become our 51st state as he posted, was met with outright rejection. The symbolism is brutal. The US offered protection, Canada chose partnership, and the global balance may not recover. And if this was just Canada's first move, what's coming next? This isn't just a defense story, it's a blueprint one. That's already being photocopied in foreign ministries from CRA to Copenhagen. Canada didn't issue a press release or wave a flag. It restructured its alliances with the quiet precision of a finance minister and the economic foresight of a wartime strategist. If SAFE succeeds, and Carney locks in Europe's industrial network while bypassing US leverage, the question isn't whether America's dominance is fading, it's how many other nations already have pens poised above dotted lines. So if you think this was Canada's final play, stay tuned, because what's being negotiated next could put entire US defense markets on notice. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your... Trump slammed Canada with a 50% tariff, accused it of betrayal, and told the world he didn't need their energy, their steel, or their friendship. This isn't some backroom squabble, it's a $750 billion economic bond pushed to the edge by ego, by miscalculation, and by one quiet Canadian response that flipped the entire script. But 10 days later, he was on the phone begging for a deal. Why? Because Canada did the unthinkable. It stood up, hit back without a single shot, and rewired the entire global trade map in silence. Fertilizer, oil, electricity, everything America thought it could bully suddenly weaponized. And what happened next inside that White House meeting, no one saw coming. What happens when a G7 ally gets treated like a trade enemy overnight? On March the 15th, 2025, the White House invoked a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security after Ontario Premier Doug Ford suggested cutting electricity exports during a regional interview. According to Bloomberg, over 15 US states depend on Canadian hydroelectric power. Yet the comment, likely rhetorical, triggered one of the fastest retaliatory escalations under Trump's second term. Caroline Leavitt, Trump's press secretary, framed Ford's remark as an egregious threat to American families. Despite no action taken, experts, including Michael Froman, former U.S. trade representative, questioned the legal basis of using Section 232 to justify the tariffs, noting Canada supplies over 25% of US aluminum imports at below market rates. But the real volatility wasn't the tariff. It was that Trump launched a trade war without notifying Canada's federal government. What looked like a rebuke of a provincial premier quickly snowballed into a full-blown diplomatic rupture, and what came next turned one of America's oldest friendships into a test of economic firepower. During a White House briefing, Caroline Leavitt held up what she called a handy-dandy chart showing Canada's 287% tariff on US butter and 245% on cheese data pulled from WTO filings. The intent was to frame Canada as a long-time economic aggressor. But trade experts like Chad Bound of the Peterson Institute noted those dairy protections had been in place for decades and were openly discussed during USMCA negotiations. Canada's supply management system was designed to stabilize local farm prices, mirroring the US approach to subsidizing corn and soy, which the Congressional Budget Office reported received more than $32 billion in federal support. In 2023 alone, the administration omitted these parallels. Instead, Trump's narrative focused on imbalances without addressing cross-spur interdependence. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, over 70% of U.S. car manufacturers use Canadian aluminum in core production, meaning the tariffs would increase production cost by up to 14% within 3 quarters. The irony, America's attempt to punish Canada's trade structure ended up squeezing its own supply chains. And the blowback wasn't limited to dairy. Canada didn't retaliate with tanks. It responded with a televised reckoning. In a nationally broadcast address, Prime Minister Mark Carney declared that the old relationship with the United States is over, calling Trump's tariff policy a strategic betrayal. The Financial Times reported that within 48 hours of the tariff, Ottawa had activated contingency talks with the EU and Japan to expand existing free trade corridors under CEDA and CPTP, unlike previous disputes. Canada framed the conflict not as a trade disagreement, but as a sovereign standoff. Carney's reference to America wanting our land, our water, our country was symbolic but also economic. Canada supplies over 90% of U.S. imported hydroelectric power and 72% of its potash-based fertilizer. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration and the International Fertilizer Association, the message was clear. This wasn't about tariffs, it was about leverage. And instead of escalating with counterpunches, Canada weaponized global legitimacy. And what made it most effective, the response wasn't shouted, it was calmly calculated. This wasn't supposed to happen. In previous trade fights, the US held leverage by GDP, by military, by market size. But when Carney said, "We are done being taken for granted," it cut deeper than any tariff. His speech landed not just because of what was said, but who was listening. According to Reuters, leaders in Germany, South Korea, and Australia immediately signaled interest in expanding bilateral trade with Canada. In response to the speech, the Canadian dollar, which initially dipped on tariff news, recovered 1.7% in 24 hours. A sign market saw Ottawa's posture not as weakness, but resilience. Inside Washington, GOP governors from Michigan and Wisconsin, both swing states, reportedly lobbied Trump's staff to reconsider, citing rising costs on US-built vehicles. Even Foxconn, a major US electronics assembler, warned of $200 million in annual losses due to disrupted aluminum sourcing. For the first time, Trump's inner circle saw a soft-spoken nation command the room without raising its voice. And what came next was even more unexpected. Just 10 days after hammering Canada with tariffs, President Trump told reporters that Prime Minister Carney had called to make a deal. But inside sources cited by Politico suggest it was Trump's team who initiated the outreach after Republican lawmakers flagged economic damage to U.S. farmers and manufacturers. Stock market indices dipped 2.1% following the tariff announcement, and Goldman Sachs issued a client alert warning that prolonged disruption with Canada. America's largest trading partner by volume could shave 0.6% of Q2 GDP. Behind the scenes, the pressure to restore talks wasn't diplomatic, it was electoral. The Midwest bloc, vital to Trump's 2024 win, was hit hardest by Canadian counter-tariffs on vehicles and agriculture. According to USDA data, U.S. pork exports to Canada fell 28% year-over-year by April 2025. Trump's public pivot telling reporters the US doesn't need to sign deals was interpreted by Bloomberg as a face-saving maneuver. But behind closed doors, the White House was drafting revised USMCA frameworks. What began as bluster had cornered the president, and now the next move wasn't his alone to make when Trump floated the idea of Canada being a great deal for the American people, suggesting it received $200 billion, subsidies and free military protection. Carney fired back with a line that froze the room. There are some places that are never for sale. According to Reuters, Carney's team viewed Trump's annexation hint not as hyperbole, but as an extension of his transactional foreign policy doctrine, one where sovereignty had a sticker price. Canada's defense budget stood at 1.4% of GDP in 2024, while the US covered 57% of NATO's total spending. But Carney's rebuttal framed this